Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anya Starovoitov, and I'm a project manager with the Sonoma Resource Conservation District. I wanted to thank you for joining us today. I know this isn't a really fun topic to discuss, and that fire recovery can often take a several-year process, especially with the natural resource lands on your property. And whether you were impacted most recently in 2020 or still fixing things up and tending to your land since the 2017 fires, I hope you'll walk away from today with some helpful information and at least the feeling that you're not alone. There's lots of us out there that are still putting the pieces back together. So this meeting is being recorded and the link is going to be provided to everyone who registered. So you're welcome to share with some of your neighbors or friends who weren't able to make it. And we have a couple of different presenters today, and I will introduce them shortly. Next slide, please. So briefly, for those folks who aren't familiar with Sonoma RCD, we have been in the community for the last 75 years. We are a special district similar to the fire districts in your area, and we're here to provide technical assistance and education to landowners about how to take care of their natural resource issues or questions on their properties. And we work with folks on a voluntary basis. So oftentimes you need to reach out to us to let us know what kind of help you need. Next slide, please. And today we'll cover lots of topics. Each one of these could take a whole 2-hour presentation to really discuss in depth, but we will give you some key points to think about as you work through recovery. These are some of the topics that we'll go through, and we will leave some time at the very end for question and answers. You will see at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A button. We would like you to please submit any questions you have during the talks through that feature of Zoom, and we will read off your questions later on. Please keep submitting them as the event continues, and we will try to get through as many questions as we can or follow up with you if we're unable to make it to your question. All right, next slide. And these are the folks who will be presenting today. After me, it'll be Kevin Cullinen with Sonoma RCD, who will touch on some erosion best management practices. Jason Mills from WRA Incorporated will help cover the invasive species and some recovery of your natural plants. And Stephanie Larson here with the UC Cooperative Extension will chat about how to use grazing for fire management and mitigation. And Joseph Thiel of NRCS will touch on some forestry BMPs, and also he and I will cover some details about potential funding to help with the recovery tasks. All right, and I can't remember. I will shift gears to Kevin so that he can start his presentation. Thank you so much.
All right, welcome everyone. So my name is Kevin Cullinen. I'm a project manager for Sonoma RCD, and I'm also a certified professional in erosion and sediment control, which is what that CPESC stands for there. And I'm just going to be discussing a few different principles and common best management practices around post-fire erosion control and winterization. So I'm just going to jump right in here. The first thing I wanted to talk about is just wildfire's impact on soils. So you can kind of see in the top picture here, we have kind of a very high intensity burn, leaves a lot of white ash. And so obviously this, destroys most of the biological matter on the surface and can really burn up the roots and resident seed bank as well. So that'd be a really intense fire. And then kind of lower down, we have the low intensity fire. So you might still have residual vegetative matter and things like that, which again, kind of impacts what sort of erosion control practices you want to recommend. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next few slides. The first kind of thing I want to talk about is just kind of all the different sorts of considerations that you would take into account before deciding on a given erosion control practice. So, you would be looking at everything from soil type, topography, again, how badly the burn was, what was the burn severity, the climate, is there oncoming rain soon, what's the land use, what's the upslope conditions, all that disturbances from firefighting that can all affect and impact the land and what practices you would recommend. But in general, we, or at least that's in the CPESC kind of frame, we generally categorize erosion control treatment into 3 kind of different techniques or categories. And so the first is soil stabilization, which essentially gets at trying to keep soil in place where it is, right? So that would include things like straw wattles, mulch, erosion control blankets, things like that. And then the second one is runoff management, which is trying to manipulate or control stormwater runoff from hillsides, either through diversion ditches or bioswales or different things like that to capture and slow down runoff and divert it into directions that you want it to go. And then the last method is sediment control, which is basically after sediment has been released through erosion and is now being transported, it's how do we capture that and control it from getting off site. And so we'll talk about a few different techniques in all those categories. And then the last thing I want to talk about is just, to be considering the life of the best management practices. So some practices are only meant to last, a year or two, such as like straw wattles. They're not meant to be reused multiple years in a row, right? So they need to be maintained and replaced as necessary versus like, maybe a long-term practice, which would probably include some sort of rock, treatment or concrete, something like that. So there's different life terms of each of these practices that you want to keep in mind. As a general principle, we like to just recommend keeping cover over bare soils wherever possible during those winter months, because you really want to protect from raindrop impact. Erosion would probably be the first one, and then again, stormwater runoff. So helping to keep cover over those bare soils is going to help a lot with that. And then secondly, sometimes the best treatment is just to wait for nature and let it do its own thing, right? So again, I'm going to jump to some recovery strategies. And that first one is just basically going off that last bullet point, which is sometimes the best approach is to do nothing, right? Is to let nature do its own thing. And sometimes less is more. But again, everything's very site specific, which leads to this next bullet point, right? Which means one size doesn't fit all. So just because your neighbor is doing something, maybe he's doing some super elaborate, erosion control method, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the correct thing to do for your property, right? So try to avoid the monkey see, monkey do mindset. And you really want to consult with experts before you decide on erosion control treatment. So the next recovery strategy here is coordination, right? So you want to make sure you're coordinating with your neighbors, because obviously you don't want to create a new problem for them, say by, trying to divert some, stormwater runoff that then creates an issue for them, and vice versa, right? So you want to make sure you coordinate with your neighbors, do, contact agencies like us, the RCD, NRCS, all these technical consultants that are talking today, and get help from those experts and licensed contractors. And then you may need to contact, if you're working around streams, you may need to contact the California Department of Fish and Wildlife or the California Water Board, maybe Army Corps of Engineers, all those organizations. But I would definitely start with California Department of Fish and Wildlife if you're working in streams. So permits may be necessary. And again, if you have questions about that, you can always contact us. The third recovery strategy here is just a little bit about slopes. So in general, you just want to make sure that you are not disturbing, unnecessarily disturbing slopes after a fire, right? Because they can be very unstable potentially. And in most cases, you actually don't want to cover them with plastic as like an emergency treatment, because they can often block the regrowth of vegetation, right? Because they're blocking sunlight, and they can also have that solarization effect and kill off, a lot of the soil fungi and bacteria, which actually, you need for that vegetative regrowth. So, there may be some exceptions, but in general, we kind of don't recommend using plastic sheeting over slopes, and much prefer straw mulch. In some cases, you may, want to divert some water. So in this lower picture, this was kind of a cut bank slide, and there was some water coming off of the roadside here. And so one treatment that they might want to consider is trying to divert that water around this kind of unstable area and making sure it outlets into, some sort of rocked or stable vegetative area versus draining directly onto this unstable fill slope here. And then the last recovery strategy I wanted to talk about is our general recommendations around runoff and drainage management, which is this four S formula, right? Which is slow it, spread it, sink it, store it. And we do actually have this publication on our website, which you can download for free. But essentially, it's the idea that you want to try to slow down hillside runoff, right? Stormwater runoff as it's coming down, and allow it to spread out and be able to infiltrate into the ground, into the different hillsides, versus concentrating where it can pick up energy and then erosive power, right? So the idea is you really want to try to get things to sheet out nicely so that they can infiltrate. And then obviously the bonus would be if you can actually store that. So we've done, a number of rainwater catchment projects, which is, you can see one of the pictures there of those rainwater catchment tanks. So roof rainwater capture is one of the projects that we've, can design and build and things like that. So that would be another option, but in general, slow it, spread it, sink it. But then the caveat there, or the caution, is that you do want to be careful about using diversions, because anytime you're trying to divert runoff, it means you're trying to control water, which means you're trying to control nature, and that can sometimes not always have the best results. So again, consult with your experts, but this link here is where you can download that slow it, spread it, sink it, store it guide. Okay, so now I just wanted to jump into the actual erosion control practices, and I'm just going to cover a few different ones that we most often come across. And the first one is mulch, right? So the benefits of mulch are that it reduces raindrop impact and erosion, right, by providing that cover to the bare soil. It's also going to slow down runoff and trap sediment. It can add organic matter to the soil, right? And it's going to help retain moisture for plants that are trying to regrow in that area. I would say, rice straw mulch is what we often recommend, just because you'll get the least amount of weeds usually with rice straw, and rice straw generally doesn't populate on those tough hillsides because it needs a lot of water to grow, right? So it's really just meant to be kind of a one and done thing. And you do want to be careful that you're not applying too much of it. So in general, we recommend a depth of about 2 to 4 inches with the straw mulch. You could also use things like wood chips if you have been, chipping fallen trees and stuff like that, or compost. If it's a really steep hillside, sometimes people will use hydromulch, but that is a pretty expensive treatment, kind of reserved for slopes, 20% or higher, that are in really kind of unstable areas, and maybe there's vulnerable structures or water resources around. But in general, I think, rice straw mulch is a great option for providing that hillside cover. But a caveat to that would be sometimes there's enough natural mulch from, say, leaf drop or other maybe fallen branches that you might not even need to purchase as much rice straw mulch as you might think. So that leaf drop you really want to pay attention to is in this upper picture. And then there's also different techniques for if trees have been felled or fallen over, that you can do this lop and scatter technique, right? So in this lower picture, this isn't quite it, but you could use these fallen branches and place them kind of on contour or perpendicular to the slope line to help try to slow down runoff as well. The next erosion control BMP would be erosion control blankets and netting, right? Which are mostly meant to keep mulch down, right? If it's a really windy area, or if it's on a steeper hillside, the erosion control blankets and netting can help to keep that mulch in place. But what's really key is that you do need to have a pretty uniform and graded surface in order for these blankets to be most effective. Because if you have a really bumpy or hummocky surface, uneven ground with lots of rocks and maybe some trees sticking out, you can get water just flowing right under that blanket, and then you might actually have more issues instead of less issues. So proper installation is really key on that. It can be expensive, but if done properly, it can help as well. So the next one is our fiber rolls or straw wattles, right? These are probably one of the most common best management practices. And why these can be so great is because they both slow down runoff, thereby controlling erosion, but they also can act as sediment traps, right? Sediment control, so they can actually capture any sediment that's being carried by that stormwater runoff. So you can kind of see in this picture here that some sediment has built up on the uphill side of this straw wattle. So I just want to talk a little bit about proper installation, but I do want to point to, we have a post-fire resources page on our website that if you go to, and there's a video section under this that has some really great videos by Community Soils, which shows how to properly install a straw wattle, and also to create this really cool like A-frame level tool to make sure you can get them on contour. Because if you don't install these straw wattles on contour, you can actually end up concentrating water, whatever downslope direction they're pointed, and then cause rilling and erosion, which you don't want. So proper location and installation is really important. And I'll just show you a typical drawing here. So this is also located on our website, but essentially you can see we often recommend digging a little trench here, around 2 to 4 inches deep, I would say, so that you can embed the straw wattle in as you're marking that out. But again, the first thing you want to do is mark those the contour line essentially, and a contour line is just a line of equal elevation, right? So if you were looking at a topographic map, it would be, you would follow one line around the hillside, and that's your line of equal elevation. So this is one staking method as well. I would say you don't necessarily need to do the double stakes here, but having stakes every 4 feet is what we recommend. And then you want to make sure you get stakes long enough. We usually recommend wood stakes. Sometimes you have to get a metal stake just to puncture through the straw wattle. And in general, we like to recommend the biodegradable straw wattles over the netting. There are some exceptions to that. So if it's right after a fire and you are actually capturing, any toxic runoff that might come from a burned structure, then you might want to have the wattles with the plastic netting, because they're going to stay intact more when you need to remove them. But otherwise, maybe 99%, 95% of the time, we recommend the biodegradable straw wattles. And then I did want to talk about seeding a little bit. In general, we like to say, wait for nature, because oftentimes nature will reseed on its own, right? There are, certain exceptions for that, and oftentimes it is site specific. When I'm out in the field or checking a site, I will often, take a scoop of dirt and see if there's, an existing seed bank in there, which is usually a good sign, if there is, that you'll get regrowth naturally. So we talked about hydroseeding a little bit already, but there might be some example where maybe you actually want to try to establish more native seedlings and things like that. Native seeds are quite expensive, but if perhaps you're trying to replace some invasive species that was previously there, then maybe that's a reason why you would want to seed during that time. You may also need to do some pruning and limbing around creek areas. You may want to also think about if there are opportunities to replant with native riparian species. But I'll leave it at that for now. And then the last, because I'm running out of time here, I wanted to talk about culverts and a little bit about road drainage. So in general, after a fire, the first thing you want to check is to make sure your pipe is actually still there, right? So you do want to go around and make sure that if you have any burned out culverts, that obviously you'd want to replace those. And in general, we say that after a fire, you can pretty much consider all those pipes undersized because of the increased runoff that you're going to get, right, from less vegetation on the hill slopes after a fire, and the increased debris that you're going to probably get in those waterways as well coming down. So it's really important that you do, pre-storm, during storm, and after storm. Make sure you really check on your culverts to make sure they're not plugged, make sure they're open all the way, and to replace, any culverts that might have burned out. If it's just like a ditch relief culvert, you don't necessarily need a permit for that. But if it's a stream crossing in a creek, then you likely would need a culvert. So you'd want to reach out to the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, where you might need to get an emergency permit for something like that. One feature, or one I would say practice that you could install fairly easily is what's called a trash rack or a debris deflector, which is pictured in this bottom photo right here, which helps to either capture debris before it gets to the culvert inlet, or helps redirect or reorient debris as it's coming down. So this is kind of what that looks like. But essentially, we recommend installing it equal to the distance of the diameter, right? So if the pipe is 24 inches in diameter, then you would install that 24 inches away from the inlet, just like that's shown. And then the last practice that I wanted to talk about is water bars, right? So very common feature that can be created with a, just a shovel if you want. But it's essentially that slow it, spread it, sink it mentality, right? Where you're trying to get water to stop concentrating on the road and instead help it sheet off the road in regular frequent intervals, right? So that you're taking away the energy from it so it can't erode as much. And then I just want to quickly show you, this is what that typical drawing of a water bar looks like. So it's kind of like a speed hump or speed bump, but there's also a little bit of a trench there to it so that it helps to get the water off the road without overtopping it. But those are annual features that you'll need to maintain each year versus say like a rolling dip, which is a larger feature, which would kind of require heavy equipment to create. And then just the last thing I'll say on that is you do want to install it at a 30 or 40 degree angle to the road versus say perpendicular to the road, and it'll function a lot better that way without overtopping. I'll skip stream bank erosion for now because I know I'm running out of time, and I'll just leave it at there, and I'll be around for questions at the end.
All right, thank you, Kevin. Lots of information there. So if you have any questions or need some clarity, please type that into the Q&A. And next we have Jason Mills with WRA Landscape Restoration, and he's a senior restoration specialist. And you might remember him with his work locally also with Sonoma Ecology Center at his former job. So Jason's going to share some information about invasive species and post-fire vegetation management. And take it away, Jason. Oh, you just need to unmute yourself.
Okay, good. Can everybody see my screen okay?
Yes, that's perfect.
Yeah. All right. Nice job, Kevin, going through the BMP bases. That was excellent. I'm going to be shifting gears over to vegetation management, a somewhat complicated and controversial subject. And overdoing this work for the past 20 years, I've seen it done effectively and not so effectively. And I think in this era of increasing fire frequency, it's critical that we use all of these resources properly in order to protect our community, our fire responders, the environment, and the climate of California. And lately, I've been doing a lot of work in Sonoma County. I came in after the Nuns, did some work on the Tubbs, the Kincaid, the Glass, the Meyer, and Walbridge fires. We've just been getting hammered in Sonoma County and wine country lately. And it's not so clear cut out there. We're dealing with a lot of ecological communities. Some of these pictures here on the bottom, you can see what we call a stand replacing fire there in the Mayakama range where the Doug firs took a real number on the Doug firs. And then over on the right there's a Sugarloaf Ridge where you see more of a mixed grassland and oak woodland composition. There you can see some of the trees have in fact been burned where they've lost their leaves and might not make it, where you can do a cambium assessment to determine whether it'll survive or not, or scorched where the leaves are still on the tree and it's more likely to recover. Whenever I'm stepping into a vegetation management project or a fuel reduction project, they're essentially one and the same, but often not seen in the same light. And I think that's a real issue because if you're dealing with managing vegetation, it's important to have a grasp of how each of these actions will amount to long-term results, not just short-term results. So here we have coming in after the Nuns, a stand of blue gum eucalyptus that looks very innocent now. And in a later slide, I'll show what that becomes in 50 to 100 years. And when I get eyes on a new site, I'm essentially going to be focusing on what I see as being the most, the biggest threats, the most aggressive plants, which are oftentimes noxious weeds. And if we focus on removing that biomass, we can be doing fuel reduction as well as habitat restoration hand in hand. And what I've observed, post-fire, you would think that the fire would lower fuels. Unfortunately, not the case. In many areas following fire, you see a proliferation of non-native invasive species, and many of them are actually from Mediterranean environments where they've adapted to evolve with frequent fire. Here they have no competitive restraints and they run out of control. When you look at where invasive plants proliferate, it's generally areas of disturbance, and nobody wants to think they're disturbing anything, but the footprint of every structure, road, anything we're putting in to alter the landscape is theoretically causing disturbance. And that's really where we see most of these invasive species establish and proliferate and then spread into wildlands from there. And it's a mix of annuals creating flashy fuels in the summer and then dense ladder fuels establishing. You guys have probably all come to know Himalayan or Armenian blackberry, which is accounting for a huge amount of biomass in our river systems and is a major invasive plant. If I were tasked with a fuel reduction project, this would be a great starting point. What we're also seeing out there, unfortunately, is a lot of invasive trees coming back aggressively after fire. Over there on Cavedale Trinity in the Myakama Range, there's swaths of Acacia dealbata coming in all over the place post-fire. And then in our river systems, we're seeing more and more tree of heaven, or not so heaven, more tree of hell really spreading. We have an invasive lanternfly that it's its host plant, so great thing to address out there. Now these plants these woody trees are not so easy as to just remove them. If you chainsaw them down, they will quickly resprout, just as they did after the fire. So they do require a cut and paint treatment or stump grinding. If you are to apply a herbicide, it's good to work with someone with the proper certifications like we have with a QAL, and go out there and we cut it and then we paint it. And it's really a very minimal amount of herbicide that's used to get control. And when you see these trees untended to, you have dense stands of invasive trees, all with a uniform growth. So essentially, this is what we're seeing out in national forest lands and reforestation projects where everything's planted at the same time. All the trees are at the same life stage. They can pose an excessive fuel threat. Here we're looking at blue gum eucalyptus on the Mill Valley Ridge. These are the trees that burn the Oakland Hills. These are the trees that throw embers for miles in windstorms and lead to spot fires, which is thought to have really been a major player in the spreading for our wind-driven fires here in Sonoma County. And when you go to address these invasive species, in our industry, we like to emphasize EDRR, which is early detection, get to them early, and respond rapidly. This is an especially critical post-fire, where you have this window to shift trajectories. And if you don't get in there and do this work, it's gonna become worse. The populations are gonna grow exponentially, and they're going to require even more resources to control. Anytime I'm stepping into an invasive plant management project, I don't like to just focus on that project site specifically, but open it up to the watershed at large and start looking at source populations within that watershed. You don't want to expend resources downstream if they're just going to keep coming in from upstream. So here we see roadside, typical roadside establishment of French broom. The seeds get into the tire treads, spread down the road, and infest wildlands. Here on the right, we have broom moving in post Nuns fire in Sonoma. This landowner paid tens of thousands of dollars to have people mow this broom it's now come right back and will be that much harder to remove. So this is why it's good to work with people who manage vegetation professionally and develop, management plans for taking this on. You got to look at the plant. There's a prescription for each species we're dealing with. Is it annual? Is it perennial? Can we stop its reproduction? When are the optimal windows for treatment? With French broom, from working on TAM for 10 years and seeing failures and success, it takes 3 pulls 2 years apart. So it's a 6-year process to wipe it out. And we do have success stories. Pepperwood had broom stands that are no longer there through volunteer work and nipping them in the bud, getting them before they go to seed. Broom in its first year, it'll get about 1 foot tall. Vegetation, no flowers, no seed. In the second year, when it's about hip high, that's when it starts dumping seed. That's when you need to get it. Best to do in the winter when it's the ground's still wet. Here's my team with WRA. We wiped out, 3 acres in a week and a half. The roots are minuscule compared to the plant. They pop out so easily. This is the way to go, manual treatments. Now here I kind of created a flow chart that I use in land management to address some of our most noxious weeds out there. And you can see a variety of treatments during the calendar year to really optimize effectiveness. And we have a lot of tools in the toolbox. We've got mechanical, anytime we're breaking out the weed whips or the brush cutters or the chainsaws, it's kind of nice to have a person behind that piece of equipment so we can do selective vegetation management. We don't just mow everything. We're mowing around natives, then you can bring in grazing animals. It's important to know every different type of livestock is going to have a different type of impact, right? Cows, sheep, goats. And they tend to do a number not just on, invasive plants, but native plants too. And there are a lot of invasive plants they won't eat, like the thistles, and those can proliferate after grazing. So, it's a tricky thing with the grazing. I like to do it in the wooey areas where I just want total vegetation knocked down. And, it is site specific. Some natives have developed compounds to resist heavy grazing from hammering them down. So you do see some natives withstanding it. And then on the right, we have, chemical treatments. To me, that's a last resort. That's when nothing else works. We break out the chemicals. And when we do it effectively. Here's a great resource, getting volunteers involved. We took out, I want to say, 2 acres along the habitat corridor of Sonoma Creek with volunteers after the Nuns fire. And it just came out so easy. This was like an Earth Day event and a One Tree volunteer group, and we did a great job. And when you go in after fire, the fire did the first round for you. So your 6-year process becomes a 4-year process when done effectively. Here's another one out there, yellow star thistle. It is the most noxious weed in the West. It establishes rapidly after fire. We went out for 2 weeks and removed 700 pounds of star thistle. Well, those 700 pounds of star thistle would have generated 300 million seeds. Those 300 million seeds exponentially expand from there. So this is a perfect example of getting in there, getting it while you can still shift trajectory and get at these, emergent populations before they have a chance to expand after fire. And, why do we do all this stuff? Well, what we need to think of is looking at these invasive species as basically a symptom that needs to be addressed. So, what they're doing is they're filling the niche habitat of the natives that were originally there. So in this case, up in the Modini Mayakama Preserve, where we did our star thistle control, we're seeing a serpentine sunflower and another aster, the flame ragwort. These are the natives that existed there before the invasives were introduced. Looking at all the broom control out there, well, you know what? There were native legumes before there was broom. Here we have a native pea, Lupinus succulentus, and then here on the right, a Rupertia. Nobody really gives this plant much attention, but I think it's a wonderful native plant. It spreads prostrate over the ground, only gets 6 to 8 inches tall, and holds water throughout the fire season. So, holistic restoration, looking at, not just getting rid of the bad guy, but moving in and then restoring it with the native to fill its niche habitat. So, the picture in the middle here, doing a fuel assessment, this was in the height of fire season in July, and still this native legume is there holding water and fixing nitrogen. And these native species, they took hundreds of millions of years to establish. They are perfectly suited to live here. It's kind of our responsibility to maintain this hard-earned biodiversity and steward our lands properly. And when it comes to forest management, well, what are we managing these forests for? Are we managing them for timber? Are we managing them for fuel reduction? Are we managing them for habitat value? Are we managing them for resiliency? Are we managing them to sequester carbon? It's pretty important to have a clear objective when you go into managing forest lands. Here on the left, you can see a big old live oak coming back after fire. These hardwoods are oftentimes resilient and can bounce back after fire. They've adapted to do so. On the right here, you see a mix of wood fern and snowberry, maidenhair fern. These are plants that pose very little fuel threat and are important for erosion control and maintaining the diversity of our understory. If you send in a contractor who's looking at it all as biomass, they're going to mow all this down, and what you're going to get back is more fuel. When we step into forest management work, looking at the coniferous forests and the softwood communities out there, they are overgrown, they are dense. We have Doug fir encroachment. It's pretty easy to just selectively mark everything with 10-inch DBH or lower and go in there and do some selective thinning. I prefer to use hand crews over equipment to minimize disturbance. And we've done some great work. I mean, out there in Oakmont, there's more to do. The community's nearly burned down twice. They could use some help. And out there on the Napa Ridge, we got ahead of it and did about 25 acres of thinning on the ridge out there. When you get into your hardwoods and your oak woodlands, to a timber operator, this is nothing but slash. It has no board feet in it. It's completely useless. To a ecologist, these are keystone plants supporting thousands of organisms. If you look at a oak woodland, a typical intact oak woodland, this was taken from Jack London on the Sonoma Mountain, you have a continuous understory of native perennial fescue grasses holding that earth in place for hundreds of years. And then you have a break in canopy vegetation. So it lends itself to a natural shaded fuel break. We can go in here, do some limbing, do some thinning, but clear cutting is not the answer. Shade is your friend. If you expose these areas to direct sun, oftentimes noxious weeds will move right in, and then you're dealing with perpetual maintenance. We will also advise on, prioritizing and looking at WUI defensible space. I am a proponent for starting from the home and working out and doing that home hardening and looking at the 0 to 5 and 5 to 30 and 30 to 100. So that's kind of our starting point. And then from there, we'll head out, look at ingress, egress, and start doing selective, thought through vegetation management to create, long-term defensible space for homeowners. And a big part of it is just kind of setting your priorities. There's a lot of work to do out there. There's limited resources. So, here on the left, this was again in Oakmont. We have some nice, resilient hardwood oaks, but their understory has been filled with introduced oleanders to create constant ladder fuel. When you have ladder fuel going into an oak, it's going to burn that canopy, and we're seeing less and less oaks bounce back after fire where we have ladder fuels. So, here's a pretty easy thing. Go in there, take out that ladder fuel, open up the canopy a bit. Then here on the right, we've got some junipers or cypresses, which were planted. It's like we already know knobcone pine and cypress have the highest fire frequency of any native plant community here. Why would we plant these same plants proximate to our homes? And here's a project we did for the Junking the Juniper program out there in Oakmont. On the top left, we've got the Brady Bunch juniper hedge that's probably been there for about 50 years. Now imagine an ember flying and landing on this carpet of vegetation. That is it's gonna land in there like a bird nest. It's gonna get down underneath, and once it hits all that dry, flammable material, it's gonna just erupt, and those flames are gonna carry right to the home, right to the roof of the home. So we stripped all that out, went in there, did a ground cover of some pea gravel, planted a bunch of native, fire-wise, eco-friendly herbaceous plants to support wildlife and pollinators. And, an ember lands on this, none of those flames are reaching the home. And we're just here to help. We're just a resource for the community. Here's my team at WRA. We're doing great work. They're a great bunch. And please don't hesitate to reach out to me directly with any questions or things I can do to help. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you, Jason, for that quick overview. And now we will shift gears to Stephanie Larson with the UC Cooperative Extension. Stephanie is a livestock advisor, I believe, am I getting that right? And actually wears a lot of other hats as well. And she will talk today about grazing for wildfire and a match graze program that we have going on in our region.
Great, thank you very much. And it's just really great to spend some time with all of you today and continue our discussion about vegetation management and the importance of that from many perspectives. And I really appreciate my two speakers ahead of me, and I'm hoping I can build on what they have shared with all of you. So I am Stephanie Larson. I'm with the University of California Cooperative Extension. My title is the Livestock and Range Management Farm Advisor. I cover Sonoma and Marin counties. We provide education and research-based information to private and public landowners in those two counties. So I'm going to talk to you today about Make America Graze Again, or my MAGA, and the benefits of grazing as a management tool. So why grazing? So we can use grazing to utilize rangeland vegetation. So that could be rangeland vegetation in our rangelands, in our forest, in our WUI areas. And grazing by wild and domestic animals is natural. It's been going on for centuries. And so grazing is one of the tools that we can use in our toolbox that Jason mentioned. Along with fire, it's one of the oldest vegetation management tools that we've had. And grazing can change plant communities. And it can change communities for good. And it can also change communities for bad. And so that's why we always want to talk about is how do we do the best grazing that we can for the goals that we want for that land. And so that's where it helps to talk about what you want from your goals, what some of the outcomes are, or maybe how to address, now that you've had a catastrophic fire, what do I do to maintain my landscape at a place that I want it to be at and to be more resilient going forward, and so that we don't have any fire issues. So we've talked about, and we look at kind of all the different tools that are available out there, whether it's chemicals, or it's prescribed fire, or grazing, or mechanical with equipment, or with hand crews kind of thing. So when you as landowners and starting to think about how am I going to manage my vegetation, whether I haven't had a fire or I've had a fire in 17, so now we're on 4 years and I've got a lot of vegetation that grew back, or I'm just a recent fire had run through my property. And so you want to think about the cost and the availability of these tools, the access, the practicality. Maybe there's some certain policies that don't allow you to use some of the tools, the social acceptability of some of these tools. Obviously, we're not going to do some prescribed burning in, say, a WUI area, and the environmental impact. So what are some of those tools going to do from an environmental perspective? And so it's really important that you start to think about, okay, what I want my landscape to look like, what are my goals, what are my resource goals, and what are the tools that we implement. And as Jason pointed out, when and do I implement those tools? Because that's really critical as well. When's the timing of those tools? So I want to focus on using grazing as your option. So we could be grazing pasture or rangelands. And rangelands are lands that have 10% less trees than 10% or less trees on them. And so if they have 10% more, they're considered forest, which you could also graze. But typically we think about rangelands as more as the oak savanna types. So if we're grazing to reduce vegetation, we can look at it that we could reduce the amount of chemicals if that was one of the tools we're using. So reduce usage of herbicides and pesticides. Perhaps we would use less mechanical tools. Fuel costs would go down. When we use these equipment, it really depends on, the aspects of the land, whether the slope, the access to getting on and off that property, and the weather. Of course, you don't want to use equipment in weather that's makes it it's too wet, maybe get stuck. And then, from a greenhouse perspective, reducing the carbon emissions from those mechanical machines. We could use hand labor, but the labor's cost, and sometimes it's not available. And so we could also look at, maybe using grazing as to reduce the fuel cost and improve our soil quality. And then if you're in vineyards or orchards, you can also use grazing as one of the tools to reduce the use of mowing or herbicide use. And then especially if you're in an organic situation, you definitely won't be using herbicides, and you could use grazing to reduce the vegetation floor on the vineyards to help, or in the orchards to help manage that. So let's look at it from a breakdown of why grazing. So obviously grazing can be cost effective on landscapes that are too steep or rocky for conventional vegetation management like the mowing and chemical, or in the urban wildland interface or the WUI, where burning's not an option. We also have what is called, and I'll go in more depth, but targeted grazing. So we think about targeted grazing as it's actually like thinking about an arrow on a target. So we have a goal in mind, and we have a specific plant or plants that we want to control. And so we use specific species of grazing animals. So whether it's cattle or sheep or goats or horses or all of the above, we look at it to see which is the best animal to choose to impact maybe invasive weeds or species, to enhance our habitat restoration efforts and reduce fine fuels and ladder fuels. So think about animals are grazing the grasses, and then they can graze the brush, which is the next rung on the ladder. And then that continuum then pushes that fire up into the trees, into the canopy. So we want to break that fire fuel ladder. And it's really important to choose the right animal. People are really fond of goats. They think they're cute, and they are. But there's also cattle and sheep that we can use to manipulate vegetation as well. So make sure in your grazing toolbox, you use all the tools in that. So all the species that are available to you. So you have to think about, the breakdown in grazing is there's going to be a management of labor. So whether you want to do the grazing, or you want to hire somebody to do the grazing, or you want to rent your property out to do the grazing, these are animals and they need to be managed. And we need to manage them so they can move from pasture to pasture. And it takes skilled labor to do that, to work with animals. And it also takes skilled employees to help deal with landowners, to deal with the neighbors, to deal with the public, maybe deal with other animals. So it could be other wildlife. We're also looking at if we're going to be moving animals from place to place, we're going to need some equipment to haul them. So maybe a truck and trailer, and obviously fencing is important. It's pretty critical. And then of course, they always need to have water. So we have to think about that. And then you have to decide, do I like having animals on my pastures year round, or do I just want them in a one and done kind of a seasonal type thing? And that works well if you're a landowner, but if you're the grazer, we have to kind of consider, where do those animals go after they leave my property? And so hoping to help them find the next property to move to, and the next property to move to, and then hopefully finding a home base, so that when there's no more places that need grazing, they can go home and be managed by the grazer at their home base. So things like also nutrition and toxic plants. We're always wanting to put animals out into the brush species when it's maybe dry, or when it's the, it's the most convenient, or because of policy. Maybe we had to wait because of bird nesting season. So we couldn't go into graze until after that happened. And that happened up until like August. And so now we're in the brush and it's late August, September, and it's really dry and the nutritional value might be low. And so thinking about from an animal perspective of when to graze those properties, but also from a toxicity perspective, and remembering that animals are pretty smart about knowing what to eat because they were trained by their parents. My mom told them what to eat, not eat. And so if you're in an urban area in the WUI, people like to feed animals and throw their yard clippings over and stuff. And that's a recipe for a bad thing to happen, because if it could be a plant that's toxic to the animals that once cut, the animal doesn't recognize that. So we have to think about nutrition for the animal, toxic plants. Obviously, predation is an issue. Depending on where you're grazing, you might have to deal with mountain lions, you might have to deal with coyotes. And then more in the urban areas, we may be looking at dogs. And so it's the idea of, do we have guardian animals with those animals? Do we have spook devices, lights, whistles, or do we actually have a herder with those animals? So again, logistics all play into this. And then we're really concerned, obviously, these are grazing animals that grazers, producers care for. And so they want them to make sure that they are healthy and they avoid any kind of issues as far as need for shade and evacuation. So why graze? So we're looking at, from a GHG perspective, is that livestock can graze. They're part of the biogenic carbon cycle. So where CO2 is in the atmosphere and is converted to carbohydrates, and I'll go into that in a little bit more. But then, yes, cattle do release methane, as do most ruminants. So we look at that as like, well, how does that compare to the burning fossil fuels that are extracting the carbon previously stored? So how does that relate to our fires that are emitting the CO2 when they burn, some of the natural resources there? So from research, we can tell you that well-managed grazing will improve water holding capacity because it improves the soil microbiome health and increases biodiversity. So if that's your goal, from capturing more water on your land, keeping it from eroding, we can provide a prescribed grazing plan that would help address those issues. Obviously, like I mentioned earlier, grazing can reduce the fire fuels and reduce the severity of the wildfires. Can aid in the weed management, so we don't need as much maybe chemical control. It can help actually improve our native species based on timing. We've got a lot of invasive species that might come up early, take a lot of the resources like rainfall and sunlight. So if we graze those and remove that competition and then remove the animals, that gives the native species the chance to come up and take advantage of the resources that are left for them. And so we might think about grazing as it could be a potential to sequester carbon in the soil and maybe act as a long-term solution to reduce the GHG emissions. So let me, state out there that yes, grazing animals do produce methane. They are ruminants, they ructate, and from that ructation comes methane. But methane, it only lasts in the atmosphere 10 years. Carbon dioxide, the CO2, can last up to 1,000 years. And nitrous oxide, which also is a gas we have to be concerned about, can last up to 110 years. So this is out of research that came out of UC Davis and the Clear Center. And so keep that in mind when we think about all the different sources of methanes that are out there. So there is a lot of man-made methane, being fossil fuel production. There's also agriculture and animal waste. There's biomass burning. Then we have kind of what we call like natural production through wetlands and other natural emissions, through lakes and termites and oceans kind of thing. And so methane is out there, and how we can mitigate some of those issues is probably something we all want to have a conversation about. So when we look at it, kind of comparing grazing to fire, so greenhouse gases versus grazing. So if we were to burn 1,000 pounds of annual grass, it's going to generate 5 pounds of particles and 1829 pounds of CO2. So 18,029. It also will produce 2 pounds of methane. Now let's compare that to grazing that same 1,000 pounds of grasslands. It's going to feed that cow for 1 month. And that cow's going to produce down the road a meat product for us that we can consume and other byproducts. It's only going to produce in that 1,000 pounds, 375 pounds of CO2 as opposed to the 1,800 pounds. But it does produce 15 pounds of methane as opposed to the 3 from the burning. So yes, it does produce, there is more methane produced from grazing animals, but much less of the CO2. So when we put that in perspective of the biogenic carbon cycle, so CO2 is in the atmosphere, and through photosynthesis, it will photosynthesis grabs CO2 and water and sunlight. That in turn then puts carbon into the soil. And so that those carbohydrates, carbon, go into the soil through the roots, and they're stored in the soil. So that's a key piece. We want to keep that in the soil. And so here comes along our grazing animal, and that animal is going to graze the grass. That's going to incentivize the roots to go down to the system to look for put more resources down. And in doing so, it's going to entice and enhance the carbon sequestration. Yes, the ruminant will release methane through ructation, but then after 10 years, that methane then turns into CO2, and the CO2 cycles back again into that system. And so if we graze properly and we keep grazing active and we manage our lands to keep enhancing the soil health and the roots and the biodiversity, we're going to sequester more carbon in those lands as opposed to lands that we haven't managed. There's no incentives for those roots to grow and to capture more carbon. So that's our goal there, is to really make that biogenic carbon cycle work. So with that and my interest in grazing, I wanted to create an opportunity for folks to see what type of grazing might work for them and to find matches for folks that have grazing and those that don't have animals to graze. So Match.Graze was created about a year ago, and it's a free online platform that connects livestock producers with landowners throughout the state of California. It helps you pair up with animals or land bases that you need. And this is run through my office, UC Cooperative Extension, and we're looking to support the expanded use of grazing to achieve California's collective habitat enhancement and fuel reduction goals. So how it got started, well, we started having fires. I've always been a proponent of grazing and the importance of grazing, and where we found some real severe impacts from the first initial fires that we have were areas that were not managed, were not grazed, or the brush hadn't been allowed to, take over the landscape. So we had really high levels of brush that would then provided that ladder fuels for the fire. So we need to manage our vegetation. So the idea that grazing could break up those ladder fuels, and were areas where it's too steep and you can't mow and it's too close to communities, what could we do? I happened upon South Dakota Grazing Exchange, where they were looking at using grazing to improve soil health. So I took that and I developed Match.Graze, and it's to work to preserve and enhance natural resources, manage fire fuels, sequester carbon, and to support local grazing. Now, grazing is not a one and done. It's not a one size fits all. It's not a one species fits all. It's really important to remember that it's varying scales. So depending on the size of your land, depends on the type of grazing and the grazing animal that you will have. But I like to look at it in 3 scales. So we have community, which is more of like a grazing collective. So say you live in a community, it's in the rural area, and you have maybe multiple landowners in that area that may have a 1/4 acre to an acre, and you find either a small scale livestock grazer in that community that could go from parcel to parcel and graze. You might find a 4-H or an FFA project that would be interested in expanding their operation, and would be responsible for moving those animals to your parcels. Typically no money's exchanged because the grazer gets the land and the forage for their animals, and you, the landowner, gets the opportunity to have your land managed and properly, and you don't have to worry about mowing it or spraying it. So the second scale is what we call a contractor targeted grazer. And that's where you hire somebody to do a specific task at a specific time and duration. So you have a specific resource goal in mind. For example, goats that were hired to come onto Fitch Mountain. That grazer was paid to bring his goats to Fitch Mountain to achieve a certain resource goal set up by the people managing Fitch Mountain. And so that grazer was paid money to bring their goats and reduce the brush, in particular on that area. Now, the third scale is what would be more like you think of traditional grazing or commercial grazers. And this is where livestock producers pay the landowner to graze their properties. So it could be seasonal or could be year round. And where the goal for the livestock person is to meet the nutritional and production goals of his or her livestock. So that's the traditional or commercial operation. So when you think about managing vegetation and looking at grazing on the short term and the long term, you might want to start in more of a small scale operation where maybe somebody comes in and does a little bit of grazing with some sheep and some goats, or you target graze because you've got a lot of brush that you want to remove that maybe came back after the fire, or you want to remove it before the next fire. So you might pay somebody, but it would be difficult and maybe a little not as sustainable to do that targeted grazing year after year after year, because you're paying that person, let's say on average $1,000 per acre every year to do the grazing. What might be more of a long-term goal is to think more of the traditional or commercial grazing. So if you have larger parcels, you might want to look at how can I implement grazing on an ongoing basis? And that might be the idea of putting in fencing, permanent fencing and permanent water, and getting a long-term grazer with a lease so that you can share those costs, or maybe that person would take on those costs and put up the fencing for you. And then you can, decide how you want it grazed and what your goals are for your resource. So there's a variety of different scales to use grazing, and I would encourage you all to explore all of them. So here's Match.Graze. So the features are, it's an interactive grazing map. You can make your own custom pins. There's a lot of resources available, and there's a how-to video. So if you haven't been to Match.Graze, I would encourage you to go. You can learn about finding a grazer in your area. If you have land, you could also put the land on for your property and what you're looking for. And then it talks about those three different scales that I mentioned: the community, the targeted, and the traditional or commercial grazers. So you can see we started this in October and February. We had a few little pins, and now in November, just recently, it's all of California and quite a few pins being profiles. So whether they're goat grazers or sheep grazers or cow grazers or all the above grazers and landowners. So people have gone on there and said, okay, I'm looking for a grazer to do 3 or 4 acres. And we've had successes, we've had matches, and people do that on their own. So I like to, jokingly calling it my dating service for cows, because we want to drive people to this website so they would use it and learn more about grazing is one of the tools that we can use. So it's real easy. You just go create a free account. Like I said, make your profile. You register that pin with that profile, and then you hopefully start grazing and start managing vegetation and start reducing our fire risk. A couple of other things that we do is we've had sheep movement and grazing. So we've done some grazing schools at the Santa Rosa Junior College. So if you're interested in being a grazer, or you're interested in learning more about how to bring grazers onto your property, we'll have another school this spring. And we just kind of demonstrate the different types of fencing that we can use and the different animals and how to move them from place to place. So that's been real successful. And then, like I mentioned earlier, we've also used some sheep grazing in vineyards, and that's fairly common, not fairly common, but common, especially in vineyards that are organic and are trying to get away from using mowing and chemicals to manage that floor vegetation. So that's another tool for grazing. So just in closing, I just want to say that, every property is different, and we've heard a lot of different options for implementing tools. So if you think grazing is one of the tools you'd like to consider, please feel free to contact me or to look at Match.Graze and find your own grazer for yourself. And then you depending on what your goals are, you can look at for fire fuels, carbon sequestration, or a variety of different things. So with that, I will stop sharing and turn it back over. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. And yes, I also encourage everyone to check out the website. There's some very neat things happening with grazing around our county. And last but not least, I'm going to shift gears to Joseph Thiel, who is our local forester with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And he will chat about doing post-fire BMPs in the forested areas and some resources that are available through NRCS to help out.
Okay, can you guys see the slideshow there?
Yes.
My notes. Great.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, I'm Joe Thiel. I work for NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service. I'm a forester. I cover Sonoma and Marin counties. Of course, most of the stuff that we're talking about today is pretty much focused on Sonoma County. But I'm going to talk to you guys. I'm going to try to power through this. I think a lot of this good stuff has been talked about by Kevin, Jason, and Stephanie, and thank you guys. That'll help set the stage for the practices that we can recommend or provide financial and technical assistance for. I'll talk a little bit about the process and the timelines that we have for deadlines as far as applications, and then how things look as far as developing a conservation plan and getting under contract with us for financial assistance. Again, just a little background on NRCS. I can just graze over this really quick. We provide voluntary and science-based assistance to agricultural producers on non-industrial private forest land or agricultural land, whether that be for grazed land or forest land, as long as it's non-commercial or non-industrial forest land. We do provide a little assistance to other agencies, federal agencies, state agencies as well. So there's that to consider as well. Oftentimes the technical assistance that we provide can work its way into financial assistance. So those planning documents, conservation plans that we develop, forest management plans that we develop, can be used to seek financial assistance for those practices that we'll discuss. And that will go into a contract for some of the programs that I'll talk about here in a little bit. Another thing that I wanted to mention really quick is that we're non-regulatory. We're not an agency. I'm not going to come in and tell you what you can't do on your property, even if it's, I just prefer not to see anything, but I'm not going to report it or anything like that. So we're not going to do anything that's going to hurt you. We're just there to help. That's where our motto comes in: helping people help the land. And everything that we provide as far as financial and technical assistance is free of charge, especially, well, anything, but coming out to your property and talking with you is part of your tax money. Some of the things that you're going to hear about that you've already heard about quite a bit throughout today so far is these words: resource concerns. And basically all those, it's pretty obvious what the resource concern is for most of you guys. It's wildfire recovery or fire hazard mitigation for the future. And for anything that's going to be for financial assistance, we have to be addressing a specific resource concern. And those resource concerns, we have some specific terminology for it. The biggest one is going to be that wildfire hazard, whether it was consumed in the last fire and now we're producing a new fire hazard, or it's mitigating before a fire happens. Degraded plant condition. Jason talked about a lot of the stuff already as far as what you can consider a degraded forest or degraded plant condition, whether that be trees after a fire recovering or struggling to recover, especially during a drought, whether that be a species composition shift, whether that be due to the previous canopy being just burned and killed, or whether that has some influence given from climate change and what species are going to be thriving now that they have a chance in the current climate that they're coming back in. regardless, that species composition is something that is important to manage, especially after some of these catastrophic fires. There's also the re-sprouts that is definitely considered a resource concern. So those bay, tan oak re-sprouts and the redwoods that are coming back as bushes, that's something that we can address with the practices. And all of these things combined, dead standing woody debris, ladder fuels, re-sprouts that are, extremely flammable, causing ladder fuels. Those are all, leading toward that overcrowding, and in the future, even higher fire hazard that we can hopefully help mitigate. There's also the insect and disease factor, whether it be related to the fire or not, or just to trees being stressed, the forest being stressed as a whole. And there's also, as Kevin was talking about, the water quality degradation, dead trees, less leaves, more sunlight on the streams, increasing that water temperature, decreasing the desirable habitat for fish and aquatic wildlife, and how we can help manage for that by either replanting or managing what's there already, as well as the excessive runoff that can be caused, leading to erosion, sediment in the streams, and again, impacting that aquatic habitat. There's some practices that we have as well for roads and infrastructure, culverts. They'll require a little bit more specific assistance from engineers that we have on staff, and they'll help develop a plan and design that we can help work into your contract as well. Talking about a little bit tighter scale here for hazard trees in decline, how do you know what trees you want to remove? And thanks again to Jason for kind of pointing this out again too. It's going to be really determined by what your management goals are. And it's going to be, whether it's around structures, whether you plan to manage the forest for future timber, with recreation, aesthetics, wildlife, resiliency, whatever those goals may be, are going to be what shift and guide what your decisions are going to be for developing a plan to move forward. As far as determining whether a tree is dangerous to you or your infrastructure or not, one of the things that I look at specifically is that live tissue or cambium damage. There's some assessments that can be done, but just visually, if you can tell that the bark has been completely sloughed off or damaged, more than half of the tree really, or 2/3, definitely it's going to be pretty dangerous to that tree's recovery, and likely it's going to at least cause some top dieback, and if it's close to a structure, potentially branches falling or the whole tree breaking off, eventually leading to that heart rot, which is going to be indicated by conchs, shelf fungus, things growing on the side of the tree. Lichen's a little different. That's actually going to be pretty good for holding moisture in and be beneficial to the tree. But what you're really looking for are those shelf fungus or conchs on the side of the tree that are indicating rot and potential for that tree to break off. And really, you're only looking at trees around structures. You want to look at 2.5 times the height of the tree. So you got a 175-foot tree that's going to be outside of your 100-foot defensible space, but it's still something that you're going to want to consider looking at removal as far as a hazard tree. Another couple of things that you can look for are lifting soil. You can look at the base of the trees. If there's fungus there, that might be an indication of root rot. You can also look at if it's recently starting to lean over, it's going to pull up the soil faster than it can fill back in, so you're going to see some cracks around the base and the tree lifting soil. As far as whether you want to leave those or not, the previous tree was probably a better example of a wildlife tree than this one here, but that was also, let me just show that picture again. This was a live oak out pretty far. And what's amazing about live oaks is what you can't see in this picture is how well this tree is actually doing. It's really doing fine. It doesn't look like it down here, but for the standpoint of a wildlife tree, yeah, I definitely wouldn't want this next to my bedroom, but for a wildlife aspect, this is a great habitat tree. And what you're looking for are those wide branches, cracks, crevices, various deformities. And really, when you come to leaving trees after, you're starting to think about thinning out the forest of what's been burned and killed, and you're trying to shape what's going to come back and what's there. You want to look at, about 4 trees per acre. Any more or less than that, you're not really seeing the utilization. If there's more than that, and it's not really meeting the needs of the wildlife, there's much less. So these practices that we're talking about that were available, whether through technical assistance, these are some of the terms that I'm going to be talking. Something important I mentioned already, this 100-foot buffer is considered defensible space. And as far as our financial assistance programs are concerned, there's not much we can help with within that 100-foot buffer. That's considered, I guess, again, defensible space, and it's kind of up to you to either find other financial programs that could help you out with that. But we do have to honor that 100-foot circle around any permanent structures, and we can work outside of that. And again, we're the first priority for fire hazard or even recovery is to expand around those important structures first. So working out from the permanent structures. So another 200 feet, another 300 feet, and then go from there. Next, you'll be looking at, stuff like roads, infrastructure, building out further off of power lines, preventing, doing hazard tree assessments along roads to prevent anything falling across the road, and looking at practices like culverts and recovering that ingress. This forest stand improvement, that's going to be the thinning. It's going to be cutting out trees. It's going to be treating all the resprouts. And that's not just before a fire, but after a fire, we can cut the dead trees out. We do have some limitations as far as diameter on those, but what you often see are those smaller trees are the ones that are creating the ladder fuels and really crowding everything. So really what we're looking for is under 10 inches. For northern spotted owl habitat, we're looking for under 8 inches, and removing all of those to create that open understory, 15, 20 feet between trees, and good spacing and species composition. We also do pruning, so we can help with, one of our practices would be pruning at 10 feet or so to lift that understory level. And then there's the woody residue treatment that will treat all of this woody debris or slash, all these branches and down trees that we're cutting down through all these other practices, whether it be through chipping, mastication, burning, and pile burns. As far as brush management, that's another one that could be treating those resprouts that you're seeing, or even on a grazed land standpoint, invasive species, or even in forest invasive species. And that's going to be, mechanical, chemical, or hand removal of all these resprouts or invasives. All of those fall under different criteria, but we do provide assistance with all of those things. There's also, again, access road improvement that we can do, installing culverts, rolling dips, that sort of thing. And planting is another big one. Of course, that's going to be a little bit more specific to the site. Oftentimes what we're seeing is the resprouts that are there just need to be thinned out and protected, and we don't need to be really planting anymore, or we're going to be overstocking the forest. Some of the more more intense fires that roll through and just it's complete die off. That we're looking at planting actual seedlings, but really, like some of the other panelists have mentioned already, sometimes it's best to just wait and see what's going to come back first. And sometimes the best thing to do is nothing. Again, these programs that I keep talking about, financial assistance, all those practices are going to fall under either that top EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or EQIP CIC, the Conservation Incentives Contracts, or the RCPP EQIP. We love our acronyms, but that EQIP CIC is going to be a combination of CSP and EQIP. CSP is enhancement practices that will help maintain the work that's already been done. That's really for folks who have already addressed resource concerns. They've been, following through with contracts. They've, completed good conservation practices already, and now they're looking to just kind of maintain it. And we can continue paying for those maintenance practices. So that's what CIC is a combination of the EQIP of all the practices I just mentioned, and then those enhancements along with it. Really the flagship is EQIP. One of the bigger things to know about EQIP is that there's a $450,000 limit, which I haven't seen met yet, especially for a private forest land. That's per year per client. So there's quite a bit of money there that you can pull from to do some work. I'm not going to talk about the payment rates just because they vary so broadly. But what we look at for completing practices or completing work on the ground, we try to hopefully meet at least 50% of what it's going to cost you to hire somebody or a contractor to come and do the work. As far as the contractors are concerned, we don't require invoices. We don't have any part in your agreement with the person that comes out to do the work, or if you do the work yourself, that's fine. But we don't ask for receipts or anything. It's all reimbursement based. So once the work is done, we'll pay based on the acreage completed and what was planned originally. And those practices that are completed need to meet NRCS standards and specifications. Those standards and specs are going to be described pretty specifically in what we call implementation requirements that I'll provide to you, or that we'll provide to you. That'll lay out exactly what we talked about during the planning process and what we're going to be doing. Again, kind of covered this already, but the contract is contract based, so you're going to be obligated to complete the practices that you agree that we're going to sign you up for. This contract is with you, not your contractor or your registered professional forester. We're non-regulatory, so that with that of not telling you what you can't do, we're also not able to really help you obtain any permits. We can give you resources to go look for, but as far as permits go, that's up to you to make sure that you're following local regulations, you're contacting the right people, and pulling the relevant permits. Whether that be for air quality, for burning the piles, or really it's not going to be relevant to removing any trees, because we're looking at lower diameter trees that aren't going to be used for sale. Again, we'll be reimbursing you for all the practices that are completed. So more often than not, you're going to have to put up the money first to your contractors. As far as timelines, I'm running out of time a little bit here, but just to give you an idea how things are going to look, we'll meet with you on the property. We'll take a look at what practices you want to complete. And this is really when we're developing that conservation plan together, and you are the one that's kind of guiding what you want to do. And I'm just there to kind of help and get you signed up for the right things, and explain what we have to offer. So that's what that conservation plan that we developed together is what will be submitted to be ranked and compared to the rest of the state. And if you're selected, because these are competitive programs, and I'm sure that you're more than likely to get funded at some point. As you can see there's four opportunities to get funded, and we'll keep pushing you through until it does. But there's a couple things that need to happen before you can actually start work. One, we need to honor that northern spotted owl nesting season, which is a biological opinion from the Fish and Wildlife Service, that we cannot do any noise producing work within that February 1st to July 9th window. So February 1st to July 9th, there's no work to be completed under our contract for forestry stuff. So for you guys, what that means is signing up now, getting contracted, you're looking at, end of July, August before you're actually getting a contractor or boots on the ground to do the work. During that nesting season is probably when we're going to be completing the net culture resource survey. So that's something else that we need to do as a federal agency, is make sure that we're not going to be disturbing any archaeological artifacts. Application deadline is something important to note here, December 10th for CAT fire. That's catastrophic fire fund pool for EQIP. So make sure if you do want to apply for these programs that you get an application to us by December 10th. There's also, that last all EQIP ranking pool that you got a little bit longer to submit. But really, the sooner we get it, the better. And we start working together to get some practices going. I'm going to skip this. This is just some eligibility stuff. So if you take a look at that third bullet, that's something that might catch folks up, especially if your property is owned by a business, and that business makes more than $900,000 average across 3 years. That's something to note. That's not something we can help with. And again, it needs to be a non-industrial forest, not a commercial property. With that, I'm open for questions or any further assistance. There's my contact information. Sorry, I went over a little bit there, Anya.
It's no worries. Thank you, Joe. Actually, I will, since it pertains to your presentation, I'll just ask this question right away while other folks turn on their videos, our presenters. One person asked, how should someone start a request for technical assistance with NRCS?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess as far as forestry stuff is concerned, you can contact me. I'm a staff forester for Sonoma County, so I'd probably be your first point of contact for that. Probably email is the best way to go, just because we're going to be sharing a lot of stuff back and forth. But I'm also available on phone.
All right, and then we had a couple of different questions talking about sourcing plants or seed for revegetation. So maybe I could bounce to Jason to answer, where could folks find good resources for native grassland or cover seeds to help with revegetation?
Well, we have some great, native plant nurseries in Sonoma County. We've got like Laguna Foundation, Calflora Nursery, and there's some others. SEC has a little one out of the Sonoma Garden Park, but that's more for like container stock. When you're looking at a scale for like significant native grass seed, I like to go through Hedgerow Farms. They're based out of the Central Valley, but they do collections from all over the state. So you can get the seed most local to your site, and they have, they do it by the ton. So you're talking about, taking it up a notch in terms of scale on reseeding. So it's good to get ahead of it. There are other seed outfits like Pacific Seed and some other ones if you hop on Google. But, ideally you're getting seed from your watershed, or at least your county.
I would just jump in real quick. For smaller projects, local seed source, there's La Ballesters, which is off of Sebastopol Road. I'll put it in the question and answer section there. I just posted a link to it, but if you just Google La Ballesters, they do have native seed mixes there as well.
Kevin, maybe you can add it into the chat window so everyone sees it right away.
Yeah, I'll do that right now.
And I would just, having done a lot of grass restoration, Elymus glaucus, blue wild rye, is like your universal species. Got a huge range, stabilizes slopes, grows quick. And then when you're in the full sun, then you're looking at Stipopulchra and Danthonia. But not too many natives can hang in the full sun. That really limits your palette.
Maybe we can include those science names in our follow-up email, Jason, so folks can remember them. I know that's a little hard to grab on the go like this. Joe, there was also a question about tree seedlings for reforestation. I know Kevin provided some input in the Q&A window of some potential options, and I don't know if you had any more to add.
I can put a couple links in there. We're really not supposed to endorse folks, but I think if there's more than one, I can add a couple. I think it's important to say that it's important to order those seedlings as early as possible. I mean, we're really looking at like a year and a half before you're going to be getting the seedlings. So order them early, way early.
And then there's also a question about should land be cleared before planting new seedlings?
I think the answer to that is, and with most forestry stuff, is sometimes and maybe. So it depends on what it looks like. I mean, are there a lot of dead trees that you're going to be removing anyways? Are you going to wait for that to resprout? And are you going to be protecting those seedlings? As far as planting stuff, you want to protect those seedlings. And going through with heavy equipment after you plant, that's probably not a good thing. So I guess it depends on your management goals again. Oak woodland, for example, you might be cutting the dead trees and selecting the resprouts, or you might be planting underneath of them and leaving wildlife trees. So it's really kind of situational.
Jason or Kevin, anything more to add?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say the same thing. I think it's really site specific, so it just kind of depends basically on all those factors that Joe was mentioning.
Yeah, and I would add in, about 3 years post-fire, the true colors really show themselves. Some of the trees will have like epicormic growth, but then fall out in year 3. Some of them will push through. So it's good to like give the tree some time, not assume everything's dead and start clear cutting, but give them a fighting chance.
All right, and on a similar note, how about replacing burnt trees? Should those be replaced with in-kind? And the example the attendee used is, should I replace a burned Douglas fir with redwood saplings? I don't know if Jason or Joe, you want to answer that first.
I love that idea. I mean, Doug firs, they have a huge range, right? They're from here all the way to Alaska and over to the Rockies. We don't have to worry about limiting our Douglas firs out there. They're fire prone, they're displacing grasslands. Redwoods, resilient, a great conifer. I like that strategy for coniferous forest restoration.
Is there any advice on sort of limits of where redwoods would do well and establish?
I mean, they're in the coast fog belt, they're pretty much all good. Once you start going inland, it's going to be harder to establish them. Planting in the wet season is key, especially with these hard periods of drought. So, anytime you're doing like container stock, I'd get an irrigation system plan in place before you start investing in, active restoration.
Joe, did you have something to add there? I saw you unmute a little bit.
Yeah, I think Jason pretty much hit some of the key points, but I think a lot of times once you get a little more interior, you're looking at the sites and soils more. You're going to be looking at what's going to be supportive of those trees, like aspects, especially. They're going to be more on north and northeastern slopes.
All right, and I do see, Stephanie, you addressed the grazing question that came in, so thank you for doing that offline. And one last question we have unanswered is, what's the best way for a neighborhood or multiple landowners to address a large broom infestation? Jason, I think that's probably in your wheelhouse.
I wish I had an end-all solution for that. I think invasive plant work is pretty hard to get funded, but as pitched as a fuel reduction project, it can get a little more traction. And I think that this is exactly what neighborhoods need to do, is pull together and start talking and unite their resources. And then if we can get access to each of those parcels, then they become polygons and we can put them into CWPPs and try to get them funded, or reach out to Joseph and see if NRCS can can help. But uniting communities on a watershed scale, that's right where we need to be going.
And I will, oh,
Can I jump in and just, I would also encourage, if you've got multiple landowners, you can go look at wildfirefuelmapper.org, and that gives you the vegetation for each of your parcels in that area. And so that would help you to start planning for long-term goals on vegetation management. So it's Wildfire Fuel Mapper, and I can put that in the chat. In it, and just what Jason said is if you work together through the CWPP, or you have a CWPP, and then you start prioritizing those practices, which are say first one is broom from a fire perspective, and get a kind of a 1 to 5 year plan, and then start looking at other things you could do as a watershed group or neighborhood group, and get doing it right now, because there'll be another round of PG&E funding available in early 2022. And so you could apply for some practices, some funding to address broom. So I would definitely get your neighborhoods together, start and making a plan to do that.
All right, thank you. And the only thing I was going to add is that for funders, seeing a larger scale project oftentimes is also a little bit easier to pitch as a project. So if you have multiple landowners and larger acreage, with a unified effort, that is often a little bit easier to sell for some grant funding. And so I again encourage you to talk. And that's a good segue for my closing thought, and that is that we all, the UC, NRCS, RCD, we all work in a non-regulatory volunteer fashion. So we don't know that your need exists unless you come to us and let us know. And then we could work to try to help bring in funding into the region to help address some of those concerns, especially when you do have several landowners that have the same concern, and we can kind of help on a bigger scale. So what I encourage you is to please go to our websites, reach out to us, communicate your needs. And for the RCD side, we also will have some funding coming online next year for post-fire recovery. It's more focused on erosion control work, but often that could involve some revegetation work around riparian areas, treating some road issues you're having, or upland erosion that was a result of the fire. And that will be mostly in the Wallbridge and the Glass fire zones that drain to the Russian River. But just because you're outside of that area doesn't mean we can't try to find funding to help you out. So please, I encourage you to be in touch with all of us and utilize us as a technical resource to help you out. And thank you to all the presenters that were here today. I hope that you found this information helpful, and thank you to all that tuned in. We appreciate your attention and wish you luck with your recovery. Have a good day, everybody.